Hi everyone. For this video, we are going to be talking about error types. There's a type 1 and a type 2 error. This is actually one of my very favorite things to teach. Usually it's my favorite day of the year, and I'm very sad that I don't get to do this with you because it raises a lot of interesting questions about the uncertainty in the real world. So, as you see on the page, it says, because of the uncertainty in the world, we occasionally come to conclusions that turn out to be wrong. We don't know that they're wrong always. We sometimes will never find out. But when you have to come to a conclusion based on incomplete data, that just happens sometimes. So the example that I give you is this. If someone claims to flip a coin and it lands heads 500 out of 500 times, you will probably conclude that it's not a fair coin, that they're lying, or that the coin itself is like two-sided or something like that. Even though you're probably right, it's certainly possible that they were telling the truth and you came to the wrong conclusion, which means you made a statistical error. Your reasoning was solid, like 500 heads in a row, very, very suspicious. I also would have said, I don't think that's a fair coin, but the possibility that that you could be wrong means that we should talk about that. So here's what we've got. When we do a hypothesis test, we either reject the null hypothesis or we fail to reject the null hypothesis. Those are the only two things that we do. If the null hypothesis turned out to be true and we rejected it, that is called a type 1 error. I did not say this a minute ago, but this little box is your guide not only to this objective but the next one, so I strongly recommend you write it down. So you reject the null hypothesis, that is a type 1 error. If you reject the null hypothesis and it turns out the null hypothesis was false and that the alternative was true, well, that's not an error. That's what's supposed to happen. So that's good. I'm just going to put a check mark there. But I'm going to leave a little space here for the next objective, just so you guys know. If you fail to reject the null hypothesis and it turns out the null hypothesis is true, that's also good. You don't want to reject something that is true. So I'm going to put a check mark there too. We're never going to write anything else in this box, but that's also a good thing. Finally, if the null hypothesis turns out to be false, but you fail to reject it, well, that's also a problem. You wanted to reject it, it was false, but you didn't. So that's called a type 2 error. And the type of error leads you to an important question, and that's this. A type 1 error, the probability of making that is alpha. And a type 2 error and a type 1 error are inversely related. So if a type 1 error goes down, the probability of that goes down, that means the probability of a type 2 error must go up, and the other way around. They don't actually ask about this on the AP test, but just so you guys know why we're even talking about this, it's really important that you understand that alpha, this is how you decide, okay? So if the type 1 error is worse, then you want a low alpha because you want the probability of that to be low. And if the type 2 error is worse, then you would rather have a high alpha because you would rather have a type 1 error than a type 2 error. This might not make sense right now, but let's take a look at the examples. So to recap, I think the easiest way to remember this is this. A type 1 error occurs when the null is true and you reject the null. I memorized this. Excuse me. I memorized this, and then I can always just remember that a type 2 error is the other wrong situation. Usually they give you what the null is. So in our first example, you are sitting on a jury. You need to decide if the person is guilty or not. So we've talked about this before. As you know, for part A, what is the null hypothesis? The null hypothesis would be, well, innocent until proven guilty. So null hypothesis is not guilty. And the alternative hypothesis, I know I didn't ask for it, but I'm going to write it, is that they are guilty. Here's the objective is what B is going to be. What would be a type 1 and a type 2 error? So a type 1 error is when the null is true, but you reject it, which means that the person is not guilty. But if you're making an error and the person is not guilty, what does that mean? Well, that means you find them guilty. So I'm going to say the person is not guilty, but you find them guilty. As I write this, I just want to point out that grammatically I could have said this a different way. I could have said you find a not guilty person guilty, or you find a person guilty who's actually innocent. As long as it describes this situation, that's a type 1 error. A type 2 error is the opposite. So a type 2 error is that the basically that the other one is true, that the person is guilty, but you don't find them guilty. So the person is guilty, but you don't find them guilty. So, which one of these is worse? Now listen, before I get into this analysis, they will not ask this on the AP test. They will not ask for your opinion, but this is why we talk about it, so I don't want you guys to lose out on this. Is it worse if a not guilty person is found guilty? Well, in that case, the person goes to jail. That's bad. In that case, the person who actually did the crime is out on the streets, and an innocent person is jail. That's bad. In a type 2 error, the person is guilty, but you don't find them guilty. In this case, the person who committed the crime is out on the streets because they're guilty and they were set free, but at least no innocent person is in jail. So which one of these is worse? Well, clearly type 1 is worse. Both of these involve the guilty person going free, but type 1 also involves an innocent person in jail. So sometimes it's hard to tell which one's worse, or it's really an opinion, but this is not one of those cases. So if a type 1 error is worse, then what that means is you want a low alpha. That's how we choose when alpha is 5% or 1% or 0.1%. If type 1 is worse, you want a lower alpha. If type 2 is worse, you want a higher alpha. That's it, every single time. Again, they're not going to ask you this, but this is why we look at these errors. Sometimes we'll never know, but that's why. Example 2. A company has made a new drug test to treat Alzheimer's and needs to test its effectiveness. They are testing against the null hypothesis that the drug is not effective. So this is the more common type of question you'll see. They tell you what the null is. So we don't have to decide. So a type 1 error would be, that the null is true and we reject it. So that the drug is not effective. But the company thinks it is. And the type 2 error would be the opposite, so that the drug is effective, but they don't think it is. I'm recording this at 10 at night, so my handwriting is getting pretty bad. The last thing we would look, this is it. Again, this is it. This is the most you'll be asked. However, to talk about this, why we look at this is which is worse. So if the drug is not effective, but the company thinks it is, that's bad. That means they're going to spend money like advertising it. People are going to take that drug who think it's going to help them, and it's actually going to do nothing. They'll probably not look for other medications because they are already taking a drug that they think it's going to work. So maybe they'll also miss out on other types of drugs that would work. The type 2 error is that the drug is effective, but they don't think it is. Well, if that's the case, the bad part about that is then they've got some drug that would help people that people aren't going to get. I don't know which one of these is worse. There's not a right answer for this like there was for the last one. The last one was like, well, they're both bad, but this one is the same but worse. This one, these are bad in different ways, and that's going to happen most of the time. So you can decide whichever one you want. But if you think that this one's worse, if you think type 1 is worse, then you want to have a low alpha. And if you think type 2 is worse, you want to have a high alpha because they're inversely related. That's always the case. I can't tell you which one to choose because I don't think it's really clear. I have an opinion, but unlike the last one, this one really is up to you. For the rest of your assignment, I think you have 3 or 4 more of these where you have to write it out yourself and choose. Again, this is just an opinion, so there's no right or wrong answer. Making sure you get the type 1 and the type 2 error is what really matters.